Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video, and today I want to talk about some of the historical research I did for my novel The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst. So if you're new here, hi, my name's Katie Lumsden. I am an editor and a booktuber and I'm also an author, and this is my novel The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst that came out earlier this year. This is my second book. My first one was called The Secrets of Hartwood Hall. And The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst is a work of historical fiction set in the 1840s, in 1841, very start of the Victorian period. And I kind of wanted to talk today about some of the research I did for this book. I did make a video back when Hartwood Hall came out about kind of how I do historical research in general, and I feel like if you're interested in sort of my general process and kind of tips for historical research, then that might be an interesting video to watch. But today I kind of wanted to talk specifically about some of the research I did for Montgomery Hurst. This video is going to be spoiler free. I'm not going to, give away anything about the novel, but I wanted to talk through some kind of specifics of some of the things I researched. My research for The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst was quite scatty and happened over a long period of time. As I kind of mentioned before on this channel, this book took me a really long time to write. I've been working on it on and off for about 8 years, and I did some of the research when I was kind of writing the book the first time around, and then I did some of the research much later on, and I've kind of been researching for it on and off for a really long time. Also, as I said back in that other video about historical research last year, I am someone who knows the Victorian period very well, having read a lot of books about it and studied it at university and read a lot of works of literature from the Victorian period. So when it comes to historical research for my books, I need to do a lot of specific research about specific things, but the kind of general broad stroke stuff is kind of in my head already. Usually when I am researching a novel, I have a research document on my computer, a Microsoft Word document, mostly full of bullet point notes, but also with some images as well. And I took a look at my research document for Montgomery Hurst, and it is 68 pages long. It is 38,000 words long. So I guess that seems like quite a lot of research, but maybe it's not that much, I have no idea. One book that was hugely helpful for writing The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, both in the kind of early stages and in the rewriting process, was this. This is Elegant Etiquette in the 19th Century by Mallory James, and it is a book that is all about etiquette in the 19th century. And it was hugely useful for me for a lot of things, both in terms of telling you about rank and title and how rank operated in 19th century Britain, also telling you about etiquette and manners, fashion, the etiquette around marriage and courtship. And I also love that this book is really good at distinguishing between manners in town and manners in the country, and how rural and urban areas might have different ideas about etiquette. And also Mallory James writes a lot about how things change over time from the beginning of the 19th century to the end of the 19th century. It's also such a hugely useful book if you're ever doing historical research, because Mallory James ends every chapter with bullet point summaries, which I feel I wouldn't necessarily need in a book I was just reading for pleasure, and this is a real pleasure, genuinely, but also that was really helpful when I was doing research as well. So this book was fantastic. If you have read The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, you will see that there is a lot in it about etiquette, and what is and isn't acceptable to do, and all of that stuff. Elegant Etiquette in the 19th century was really useful for that. I also feel it was really useful for unpicking some of the things that are hinted at but not fully explained within 19th century novels, because obviously they were written for an audience who would understand the etiquette, and if you know about the etiquette too, then you can pick up on some nuances and intricacies that you might not otherwise. Sticking with the kind of smaller detail stuff, because as I said, a lot of the big picture stuff is in my head already, and it's the small details that I find I need to research. Mimi Matthews' book, A Victorian Lady's Guide to Fashion and Beauty, was really useful in terms of looking at fashion and how it changed, and this book kind of goes through decade by decade, which I found really useful. Victorian fashion as a whole, but especially Victorian women's fashion, changed a lot, and I think what we often think of as Victorian fashion was 1850s crinolines, and actually that wasn't always the style. Another thing I also did a lot when thinking about what clothes people were wearing was Google Victorian fashion plates. You can find a lot of Victorian fashion plates online, both men's fashion and women's fashion, and they are really, really interesting to look at, both in terms of the colour and the kinds of dresses and the styles. And I spent a lot of time when writing The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst Googling Victorian fashion plates, or like early Victorian fashion plates, 1840s fashion plates, whatever, to see what kind of clothes these people would have been wearing. As I said at the beginning of this video, I work as an editor. I'm now a fiction editor. I'm a freelance fiction editor, though I've worked in-house for various fiction publishers. But previously, I also used to work in non-fiction. And when I first started working on The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, when I first started writing it many years ago, I worked for a publisher called Octopus, and the books I worked on were the Miller's Antiques Guides. I worked with Judith Miller, who was a fantastic antiques expert, and she was basically like the in-house writer of Miller's Antiques Guides, and I worked with her on the books. And then working with Judith was so fun and also so helpful for me in terms of teaching me about the history of physical objects. And there's so much about like the history of furniture and many other things that I learned from working on the Miller's Antiques Guides. And I feel like it's one thing to know that the Victorians often carried calling cards, and it's another thing to see like the immense intricacy and beauty of the calling card cases that some of them held. So I feel like learning about small details and everyday objects from working with the Miller's Antiques Guides was really, really helpful back in the day when I had first started working on The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst. And I still find when I'm working on historical fiction, if I want to describe a piece of furniture, like I often go to auction house websites and look up a specific piece of furniture from the right time period. Another specific I really wanted to make sure I got right within The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst was the music. There's one character in particular, Felicia Elton, who plays the piano, and there's quite a lot of scenes of her playing the piano. And I play the piano, or at least I have played the piano. I haven't actually played my keyboard for ages, but I can play the piano, and I used to play it a lot more than I do. So a lot of the like technical stuff I knew I could write, but I wanted to make sure that the pieces she were playing were the correct pieces. And so I looked a lot at, you know, what composers were working at that time and what kind of music she would have access to. And then I also consulted Claudia from Spinster's Library, who is a wonderful booktuber. If you don't know her channel, I'll link it down below. And she has studied music history, so I asked her for some like recommendations of, you know, who people would be playing at this time, and a few of the composers who made their way into the novel and I mentioned are composers Claudia recommended, as well as others that I knew of or wanted to include myself. So that was really fun. I wanted to talk a bit about like setting research. At the beginning of The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, there is a map, and I had a lot of fun creating this map. I didn't draw it myself. A wonderful illustrator called Neil Gower drew it, but he drew it from my far less pretty drawing, but you know, all the things were in the same place in my drawing, and they just looked a lot less good. And this drawing that I did of this map was kind of based on looking at a lot of 19th century maps and trying to make this look like it was a real place. Also, if you look very closely at the map, you may be able to see that all the different houses are like slightly different shapes. And that is because when I was working on The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, I had a house in mind for each of the houses in the book, and so I had drawn them on my own map to be the shape of the houses I had in mind, and I ended up sending those pictures to the illustrator, who then drew up the houses to look like the houses they are meant to be. And when I say they're meant to be, what I mean is that I have no visual imagination, so if I want to describe something, I have to Google until I find something that looks the right kind of thing. So when I was writing about all these families in The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst who live in these big houses, I had to find real houses still standing in the UK and look at photographs of them. And when I was looking at houses, the things I was chiefly thinking about were when was the house built, because it's important that some of these houses were built much longer ago than other houses. You know, a lot of the upper class gentry families living in the Victorian period would be living in old houses that have been around for a long time, and it's quite important within the novel that a family like the Ashpoints, who are new money, are living in a much newer house than the Earl and Countess of Wickford. And it was also important for me to think about the size and the grandeur of these houses. So I can tell you that Ludwell Manor, where the Elton family live, is based on somewhere called Hanbury Hall. Radcliffe Park, where Mr Hurst lives, is based on Corsham Court. I will also say that I know I have said before that Hartwood Hall in The Secrets of Hartwood Hall is also based on Corsham Court, and it is a very, very different place to Radcliffe. Like, it's described described in a very different style and atmosphere, but they are both in their way based on Corsham Court. Basically, I spent a lot of time in Corsham Court when I was doing my Masters in Creative Writing, because that was where the classes were, and it's beautiful and I love it, and I just like to put it in all books. Anyway, Wickford Towers is based on Oxburgh Hall, which I have been to before, though not for a long time. Ashpoint Hall is based on Horton Hall. As you can see, a lot more modern, but very grand. Maddox Court is based on Avebury Manor. Netherworth is based on Uphook House, and Ashpoint Brewery is based on Hook Norton Brewery. More on that very soon. I had a lot of fun scouring Google and looking for National Trust properties that fitted what I wanted for each house in order to help me describe them more. Two modern non-fiction books that were really useful in terms of telling me about kind of everyday Victorian domestic life would be The Victorian House by Judith Flanders and How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman. I know I have spoken about these books on my channel before, but they're both really interesting works of non-fiction about the Victorian period, with a lot of really interesting details of everyday life. And The Victorian House especially was really helpful when I was writing The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst the first time around, and as you can see, I've got many tabs in this book. But I also like to get my details of everyday Victorian life from primary sources. For example, if I'm ever like describing a meal that someone is having in a work of historical fiction, and there are many extravagant feasts in The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, then I often look at Mrs Beeton's book of household management and look at her like suggested recipes and meal plans. I also find that novels from the Victorian period are really useful for details about everyday life. I know I made a separate video talking about the novels that inspired The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, but I feel like there are certain books such as Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell that gave me like so many little details of everyday life that made their way into The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst. So in general, when I'm reading primary sources for historical research, I often get them from Google Books, which has a lot of digitized books from the 19th century that you can read through. And I often go to the British Library as well. They have a great catalogue and a lot of really interesting books, including a lot of great primary sources from the 19th century. And when I was researching for The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, when I was rewriting it the second time, I read some interesting conduct books. They often have very interesting titles. I read books such as Advice to Young Ladies on the Conduct of Life with Friendly Hints, How to Make Home Happy in the Married State from 1859, or Women's Rights and Duties Considered with Relation to Their Influence on Society and on Her Own Condition by a Woman, 1840. Victorian conduct books have hilarious titles and are like both amusing and deeply depressing in so many different ways. And then I also read quite a lot of Victorian diaries. Most of these I read through the British Library. And when I say I read Victorian diaries, like these are Victorian diaries that were printed and edited and published at some point, but often quite a while ago. But I'm not like looking through, you know, handwritten manuscripts myself, cool as that would be. I haven't done that yet. And there were quite a lot of things I was looking for when reading Victorian diaries. I was looking for details of everyday life and especially like rural and small town life. And I was looking at, you know, gender and class and all of the kind of things that make their way into the book as themes. One thing I was kind of especially looking for was kind of like rural festivals and like how the seasons and the time of year affected everyday life at different points in the year if you were living in a rural community. It's not a spoiler to say that at some point within The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst there is a harvest ball, and I was really like scouring through lots of diaries to find details of like harvest celebrations, which I found so useful and so interesting. I read a lot of different Victorian diaries, but some of the highlights were the Diary of a Victorian Squire, which was a collection of diary entries and letters from Dearman and Emily Birchall. I also read the diaries of a young woman called Emily Smith. Her diaries were really interesting. I read some of the diaries of William Cotton Risley, who was a vicar. And I also read the diaries of Lady Adela Capel of Cassiobury, which is a diary from the 1840s of a 13-year-old earl's daughter. And this was really interesting in terms of looking at like childhood and adolescence within the upper classes. And all of these diaries, I should say, like were mostly from the 1830s and 1840s, because society and life was changing a lot over the Victorian period, so I really wanted to focus on that early Victorian period. I also read a really interesting collection called Victorian Diaries, The Daily Lives of Victorian Men and Women, edited by Heather Cretan, which was a collection of a lot of different diaries from a lot of different kinds of people in the Victorian period. That was very interesting too. And then I also read a lot of Anne Lister's diaries, edited by Helena Whitbread. Now, Anne Lister is a really, really interesting historical figure. If you don't know about her, I highly recommend finding out more about her. So she was born in 1791 and died in 1840. So she died kind of just before The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst is set. She was from the upper classes. She ended up becoming a landowner later in life, and she kept this diary throughout her life, and parts of the diary she just wrote out normally, and then the other part of the diary she wrote in code. And there are a lot of different things that Anne Lister chose to write in code to hide them from the world. Sometimes just her inner thoughts and emotions, sometimes her thoughts about money, and also the fact that she was having romantic and sexual relationships with women. And she writes a lot in her diaries about these relationships in a way that is fascinating. I feel like Anne Lister's diaries are such like a necessary reading for anyone interested in queer history, but also for anyone interested in women's history and the history of class. Like, there's so much in her diaries that are just so rich, and if you have any interest in history in any way, I feel like you'll find them fascinating. I tabbed Anne Lister's diaries a lot, and when I said I had like 68 pages of notes in my research document from Montgomery Hurst, I'm pretty sure like 10 pages of them at least are notes about Anne Lister. Within The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, one of the central characters, Amelia Ashpoint, is having a secret relationship with Clara, another young woman who lives in the neighbourhood. And because that element is quite like a big part of the story, I wanted to do a lot of research about queer history in the early 19th century, and Anne Lister's diaries were absolutely like pivotal for that, and were hugely interesting. And what I found interesting as well is that I wrote The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst a long time ago, and then I was rewriting it while I was reading Anne Lister's diaries, and I learnt a lot from them that changed things about the book, but also there was a lot that was already in the book where I was reading Anne Lister's diaries, and they were like corroborating things I had written, which was really, really encouraging. In the rest of my kind of research about queer history, I also read this book right back when I was writing The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst the first time. This is Same-Sex Love, 1700 to 1957 by Jill Rossini. This was a really interesting book. It's been a long time since I read it now, but it was really useful when I was starting out work on this project many years ago. I also read some of a really fascinating book by Sharon Marcus called Between Women, Friendship, Desire and Marriage in Victorian England. I didn't read this book cover to cover. I read sort of a few chapters that were particularly relevant, but it was so interesting that I do really want to go back and read it in full sometime. I also read quite a lot at the British Library about the 1864 Codrington divorce trial, which is a really interesting Victorian divorce trial, you know, a real thing that happened in 1864, where the wife's relations with another woman were like the central point of the divorce trial. So that's, you know, quite a rare Victorian instance of like public discussion about lesbian relationships, so that was really interesting to read about as well. Another thing I had to do a lot of research on when it came to writing The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst is breweries and brewing. So one of the main characters, Mr Ashpoint, who is Amelia's father, is a brewer. He owns and runs a brewery. He is sort of a self-made man, but his father like was making a success of the business as well before he took over, but he's kind of like new money, and he has a lot of like class anxiety about his social position, and there are scenes that take place in the brewery. Mr Ashpoint is a brewer, and there are some other characters in the book who also work in the brewery, and I really wanted to make sure that the scenes in the brewery made sense and worked and were technically accurate, so I read so much about brewing. So I began by reading lots of books about brewing. I read some modern books about brewing, and then I read a lot of primary sources, technical guides and advice books published in the Victorian period for people who were brewing, often aimed at people who were brewing on a small scale, because although there were big sort of more industrial breweries, often like farmers and landowners would have like a small brewery where they would do a bit of brewing kind of on the side. I read a lot of these through Google Books or the British Library, and they were really, really helpful, but also like exceptionally hard to get my head around, and they had excellent titles such as The Art of Brewing and Fermenting from 1836, or The Town and Country Brewery Book, Every Man His Own Brewer from 1830. And in my research at the British Library, I also came across some diaries from a small town brewer called A Chronicle of Small Beer, the Early Victorian Diaries of a Hertfordshire Brewer. So these span from like 1827 through to 1861. John Izzard Pryor of Baldock kept a diary through a lot of his life, and these diaries were really interesting, both in terms of what he said about brewing, but also in terms of like his class position and the class position of his children in comparison to him, and like how he thought about class was just fascinating and really useful for the book. And then the more I read about brewing, the more I realised that I really didn't understand what was being said in all of these books. So I started to look for a brewery museum that I could visit, and I found Hook Norton Brewery, which was like the most useful, exciting find of all my research, because Hook Norton Brewery is a brewery that was built in the late Victorian period, so in the 1890s, and then also some bits of it were built in the 1900s, but it is a Victorian brewery that still functions as a Victorian brewery. So it is a working brewery, and you can buy beer from Hook Norton, but its equipment is still Victorian style and Victorian technology, and you can go on a brewery tour there. So I took myself on a research day trip to Hook Norton Brewery. I went on a brewery tour, and you can also do like a walking tour of the village, so I did that too. This was just so hugely helpful because seeing all the machinery and the equipment like made me understand all the things I had been reading. And even though, as I said, Hook Norton Brewery is from the 1890s, quite a long way after The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst was set, because a lot of the processes and equipment were still similar, it helped me understand all the earlier sources I had been reading, and it was also really helpful to learn kind of more about Hook Norton as a place and how the brewery influenced the place. Going on a tour of Hook Norton Brewery was absolutely fascinating. I will say I feel like I'm probably the only person who has ever been on a brewery tour who doesn't like beer, but it was so useful, it was so great. And I feel like going to Hook Norton Brewery and reading Listas Diaries were like the two most useful pieces of research I did for The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst that like influenced the book the most. Okay, I think those are all the things I wanted to talk about today. Just some like little highlights and snapshots of my research for The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst. I really enjoy doing historical research, and it's really good fun. The book that I'm writing at the moment, I have had to do so much research for, and like a lot more research than I usually do, and in quite like different directions, and that has been really fun. So hopefully I'll have, you know, other videos about historical research up one day in the future. But yeah, I hope you have enjoyed this video and learning more about my research process. Let me know down in the comments if you have any thoughts or questions. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.